think it's important for designers and architects to be very
Yeah.
mindful of these kind of aspects that our buildings have a really real impact on people's behavior. So
One thing I love to do is think about like the architecture for architects, right?
mm,
We are very fascinated in talking about a lot of certain aspects of architecture that 99.9% of the human race wouldn't even notice.
yeah,
And that's all, again, a model that's built in their mind based off of their culture, their context, what they've been told and taught, what they've been given is this is what a school is, this is what a grocery store is, this is where a good place for a playground is. But it's a model that we
yeah.
were trained on a model.
Welcome to episode 5 of Unverified. I'm also Andrasi, and today I'm joined by Matt Seager, architect out of Perkins& Will's Seattle office. Today we'll be diving into Matt's thesis from the University of Washington, Insecurity in the Built Environment, and going into his research in neuroscience and how that affects architecture. Please enjoy the conversation. Well, welcome to Unverified, Matt. I've been looking forward to our conversation for a long time. Mostly because we always have great conversations. I know you've been helping out on the digital practice side for a while, but we finally got to meet in New York, even for just a little bit. I always appreciate your opinions, and really happy to have you on, man.
Glad to be here.
Cool, man. Well, I think could we start with maybe a little introduction on yourself?
Yeah, I'm a project architect at Perkins& Will Seattle office. Yeah, I got my undergraduate degree back in 2012 from the University of Texas Arlington, and graduate degree from University of Washington in 2018. And I've been practicing architecture for over 10 years. I have a deep love for philosophy and kind of evidence-based design, and how does theory and science apply to architecture. That also feels perfectly in with my love and passion for architecture and people and designing spaces and trying to understand humans and the spaces that we design for them. So
No, I appreciate that, Matt. I mean, that's I think a really good segue into our conversation. When we were discussing topics, uh, it was kind of open ended, right? And then you mentioned your thesis on insecurity and how that feeds into the built environment. And we started kind of expanding on research based design, science, and how that affects architecture. But I think zooming back in, uh, your thesis is the perfect place to start this conversation. Uh, you know, I read through it, and it is kind of intense, man.
did you guys start to finish? Did you cover the whole thing?
I did,
Oh wow.
and my brain is still melting a little bit, but I think I took what I could from the piece, and especially where it comes into like just a broader perspective of um, how we can apply so much. There's so much like different just like fields of study and like areas of interest that can really speak to architecture in like a different perspective. And I think maybe it comes down to the shared human element of this whole thing. Like we're all just people living in places, but I mean, this is me rambling on, and the whole point of the the podcast is getting guests on and getting their interesting opinions. So, uh, yeah, do you want to talk about what I think maybe?
Yeah.
Um, I guess the question is what brought you to the topic, and maybe give a brief overview of the thesis.
Yeah. That's a it's a fun story that I actually reprised earlier today while I was kind of stewing on how did I even get there, right? So it all started. I took a philosophy course back in community college, way back before I even fully committed to architecture, and that was profoundly life changing because I already had all these political thoughts and ideas, and then I started learning various ways to look at the world through philosophy, through the lens of philosophy. So fast forward all the way to my graduate degree. I'm at the University of Washington, and I'm getting exposed from a sustainability standpoint and design to circadian rhythm
Mm.
and how light impacts the body and health of occupants. And that was a very different thought because at the time it was a fairly new application into architecture. We were getting grasshopper tools built locally by people at the university and local architects to really study and see how we calculate that in design. And so, just back up a little bit, circadian rhythm is a non-conscious experience that releases hormones and creates interactions in your body based off of the quality of light. And it really ties to the time of day, the color of light. So all these things that were happening completely not conscious to people, but were shaped by the environment that we were designing was profound to me. And so the next year, I was in a 2 month program in the Rome, the Rome program for the University of Washington. I was in Rome for about 2.5 months. And this is kind of really where it took off because then I started bringing in my love for history and my love for philosophy and applying it to this kind of impact of space on people. I had had courses on colonial architecture and the impacts and intent behind the design to subject and exploit populations and people. And so here I am in Italy, surrounded by historic architecture, big religious or buildings, a lot of fascist monuments and buildings from the mid-century, all of which were designed with intent to change people's minds and really take somebody away. And so I'm in this beautiful world where I'm exposed to all this, and I have to write a research paper for the history portion of the class. So what I did, they had a little library there, and one book jumped off the shelf to me, and that was Neil Leach's Anesthetics of Architecture. And that book took me away. What it did, it was talking about the use of image and humans' preoccupation with image and how that kind of anesthetized architects and designers to the world. And it was this obsession of that consumption of image that started to bury intent and meaning. We just kind of got carried away with just consuming and producing images. And then that directly tied and introduced me to Walter Benjamin's art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which Walter Benjamin highly recommend looking into his story. It's tragic, it's profound, it's deep, and but his observations on how people experience space throughout their lives and the impacts it has and the use of imagery in life can profoundly impact humanity. And the sad part of his story is he ended up taking his own life on account of the Nazi occupation of France and his inability to escape. So his perspective really covered how fascists used imagery to just manipulate populations. And he came from a background of a lot of uh, architectural and city and urban experiences. So essentially, long story short, for him, the ability for images and forms and objects to be manipulated, have them removed from their actual context, have a picture of a cathedral, have a image of a leader on a balcony, really be taken from, well, this is the real thing that happened, but we're going to change the context and add our own political charge and meaning. And that essentially allows for masses of people to be grouped together with some form of like mass self-expression, which leads to self-alienation and the destruction of humanity just through aesthetic means and reproduction. So a lot of heavy stuff here. I could
It
pause
gets
for a
me.
moment.
Yeah, I mean, it has me reflecting on my own personal experience. I had the opportunity to spend the summer in Hungary with my family in Budapest, right before I started college, essentially. And I remember having a how the like the ancient cathedrals, Saint Ifan Cathedral in Budapest, and some other really beautiful churches. How like as soon as you cross the threshold into that space, it provided a very physical impact, at least for me. And I thought that was really fascinating at the time, and very powerful. And I think even at the time I knew, I'm like, the people who designed this building designed it in such a way that it would have this impressive kind of feeling on me. And um, that I think has always kind of lingered in my mind. So I think the points you're making really resonate towards my experience as well, and I feel like a lot of people's, right? I mean, we all
Yeah.
we all live in buildings, and we all, hopefully, a lot of us get a chance to, visit these very historic and impactful sites and kind of see it firsthand. And um,
Yeah.
you can think about it like you're in an old school or something, and you're like, man, it doesn't feel comfortable to learn in, and or a hospital, and it's like, too many people in the corridors and super outdated and kind of dirty or something, and it's like it's not a good
Yeah.
place for healing. So it's very, I think it's important for designers and architects to be very
Yeah.
mindful of these kind of aspects that our buildings have a really real impact on people's behavior. So
Yeah. There's an intent, right? That goes along with the use of shaping a space and an image of a space, and how we take that in. Um, so to get through all the philosophical stuff, really, like that tied directly into so much stuff with Friedrich Nietzsche's use and abuse of history, where he predicted that history would become commodified and exploited and manipulated for bad uses to move groups of people and control them. And then tying that back to the art, I'm there in Rome and I'm studying Piranesi and Hubert Robert and Giorgio de Chirico and their uses of monumentality in architecture to really drive that nationalist, that imagination. So, Robert is painting, hobbits in the Colosseum, which if you walked up to that painting right now, it's sitting on the wall at the Dallas Museum of Art. It's one of my favorite paintings of all time because it captured me as a youth. But it's a picture of the Colosseum and these quote hobbits or hermits, sorry, hermits living, and they're just kind of like camping out in the ruins of the Colosseum. And he painted this centuries ago, and in my mind, I thought this was real. I always thought this was, wow, this was really what the Colosseum was like in that century. And then as I grew up and learned more about the art, I found out that entire scene was fake.
hmm.
It was just there to sensationalize an aspect of these old Roman ruins. And I immediately felt abused, exploited, right? I was like, oh, I've been lied to this whole time through an image because I didn't know the context of which and the intent of the creator and the way that it was put in front of me. The curator has the power to dictate how I ingest that experience. And it was all wrong from the reality of what it was, which was a fictional image. So all this is just, I'm in Rome and I'm just getting jarred. And then I come back and I take on this thesis project. I'm like, all right, well, I need to understand this whole concept of what is happening in my brain to cause this. Because in reality, this is all happening in my head, right?
Hmm.
I'm taking in stimuli from the world, I'm processing it, and it's creating an emotion and a response and a behavior, and it's impacting me in a very direct way, right? So that took me down a whole other road of philosophy. And I'll shorten this one a bit, but it was the book Meeting the Universe Halfway by Karen Barad was put in front of me by an architecture professor here at UW, Vikram Prakash. Changed a lot of things in the way I looked at the world. But essentially, Karen Barad shaped, really tried to describe the relationship between humans and their world through quantum physics and these relationships. And being that the way that we interpret the world through kind of a metaphor of a scientific study is that there's an act of measurement. What we see is just this moment in time that we captured, and it's this meeting, this literal meaning, she says, for where the natural, where matter and meaning meet, and that is a social and a natural element come together to create some level of experience. And so it's key to explaining this active measurement with two different things. Is it's a boundary making process, meaning to take a moment to take a photo of something. Let's just say we're taking a photo or a measurement or looking at a microscope at a cell, and we're capturing the light at that very moment. In that process, we are actively choosing to capture something. And by capturing that, we are excluding that which is not in that image. So metaphorically, we could talk about we're looking at a picture, but we don't know the context of it. It's this act of capturing something, and we're creating a boundary between what we're seeing versus what we're not seeing. And then that process is also in her description is an interaction, not an interaction. So the interaction is a binary relationship between a subject and an object. So an interaction is an acknowledgement that we are an entangled agency, that we are of the same world. We are not separate entities, but we are of the same world. So we are made of the similar materials, that we have a mutual agency back and forth, that we're intra-acting and not interacting with each other. So let's just kind of bring that back to something that we can understand, which is the visual system, right? We can see certain waves, but we can't see infrared, for example, right? So our body is making this moment where it's able to capture a visual experience, but it doesn't capture the whole experience. It's not capable of it. So there's a boundary between what we experience versus what is reality in the world. Same thing with audio, right? We can hear certain frequencies, we can't hear others. So we have this world, this reality, that we see, but we can't experience all of it because of our faculties, our ability.
Everybody's ability is kind of different, right?
Right.
And you have no idea what another person
Right.
may or may not experience visually, audio, audibly, mentally, anything, right? Physically.
Hmm.
Um, Man, that's a rabbit hole, and you chose to dive down it for your thesis, huh?
I went, I went down it. I went down it. I wanted to experience a part of the world, and I wanted to get to learn myself and what it is that I'm doing to other people through the process of design. So, it's a lot of things jumping left and right here. But it ultimately came down to I am of this world. I'm designing for people in this world. And in that process of experiencing and dictating through design what I want somebody to experience or how I want them to fulfill their workday through some control of their space, that in that process, I'm dictating something and including, but I'm also excluding certain elements of reality and their experience. And because of that, and that act of measurement, right, we all have different systems that we're working with as we experience the world through that act, that I need to acknowledge that I can't understand what everybody's going through. I don't know the world as a colorblind individual. I don't know the world through someone has hearing, differences or any other kind of neurodiversity or physical difference in the way that they take the world in.
Mhm.
And then that's only a small part of the story then, right? That's just the process of taking in, and that's where we get to the neuroscience part of it,
That's what I was gonna
right? That
say. Let's
that's
dive
that's
in.
where we segue from, like, here's how we got here. Now we go into the brain,
Right.
right?
So, I know we're not to caveat for the audience. We're both not neuroscientists.
Totally
Um,
not.
but it's you learn some stuff, right?
You do.
And I think trying to apply it and trying to we could go to experts and stuff and try to apply it to architecture. And what I think is, yeah, I mean, this whole conversation is just super fascinating in terms of, oh, there you go. Sorry, I lost you for a second. I guess to zoom back out, going to your thesis and talking about Yeah, neuroscience. So that was kind of the big research that you had to do for
Yeah.
this thesis. And we
Yeah.
were kind of I find it very fascinating what you brought you to this subject. And now it's like you have Pandora's box in your hand and you got to open it. So you opened it
Mhm.
up and now you're learning about the brain and like how we perceive. And
Yeah.
what's some insights, man?
Yeah, the insights is just going back to your caveat, right? Not educated in science, totally self-taught, self-guided adventure into this world. And thankfully, there's a lot of wonderful studies, a lot of digestible work. You know, there's a book called scroll down here in my notes so I get it right, but Welcome to Your World, that was written very digestible for architects, written by Sarah Williams Goldhagen. Would recommend that book because it really makes it digestible for designers to engage with the neurological experience and systems in the body. But it also ties you to a lot of other studies and things that have gone on. So then that's where that rabbit hole goes. And then you start reading scientific studies and you see the whole world that opens up in front of you. And it's a lot of great work by institutions and scientists just trying to understand the brain, which is still at this point, all the science that we exists right now will probably be mostly disproven as more and more tools and abilities and science can happen and be reviewed, experiments, data, as we're able to crunch it, as the machines get better, right? We're going to be proving all our old theories wrong. And that's what science is, right? Science isn't this, solid truth. It is this moment in time of this is our peer reviewed best understanding of this topic. Here you go.
Yeah,
Somebody take this further and prove it wrong. So taking that moment in time and trying to understand where we are with the brain and how we map spaces, how does memory impact our experiences, how does memory just generally impact how we react to things, right? How flawed is our memory? How much do we think about ourselves in the world is actually just fundamentally wrong,
yeah.
right? Um,
Well,
so yeah,
thinking about that memory, um, you mentioned memories being flawed. Um,
yeah.
that's interesting. Especially I have two kiddos, and they
Hmm.
fact check me constantly. Where no, Dad, you said the tooth fairy's real or whatever. Like it's and
Right.
it's like oh man, they are very good fact checkers, and it makes me question even things I've
Hmm.
said in the past. Um, yeah, so
Yeah.
that how concrete are our memories really? And did you
Yeah.
come across anything regarding that?
Yeah. That is it's a fascinating topic, and a fast moving one at that. After all my research that I did and reading, I I I cut myself a lot of slack. Let's just say that. I walked through life thinking that I had a bad memory for a lot of things. Good memories for some, bad for others. I'm not a storyteller.
Mm.
So I joke that my brother knows more about my life than I do because he's a storyteller. And the aspect of that is he's constantly retelling a story, right? So he's exercising those, muscles in the brain, those faculties, and it keeps details and things fresh. So to back up a little bit, the main theory I'm getting at here is that memory is not a thing that exists in a solid state. You don't have a bank of memories. You don't have this hard drive in here storing up your past. Memory exists only at the time that it is recalled. And so to back that up a little bit and super oversimplifying, not give credit to the science world, the neuroscience world here, uh, your brain is just firing electrical and chemical signals when it interprets something. And what that is creating this pattern of, again, oversimplification, ones and zeros. Let's just say ones and zeros. There's gradients involved. It's nonlinear. You've got this complex network of things going on, firing all at one time, back and forth between your amygdala and your hippocampus and your prefrontal cortex, right? Just pinging the parts of the brain that make you think, that are subconscious, are conscious. And what you experience when you remember something is that moment it's happening, like the firing
Mm.
going on in your brain. That is the image you're seeing in your mind. So it's not that you're just kind of opening up a file on your desktop and watching that video again.
Yeah.
It's happening in your brain. You're replaying it in your brain. And that is a series of things firing. So you can imagine over time, a couple ones over here start shifting the narrative a little bit on a detail. Every time you recall it, there's always a good chance some aspect of it is now incorrect. And because that's the case, because it only exists when you recall it, it is deeply subject to flaws. So all these studies are during, like, you get brain damage. What does that do to a memory? There's been numerous studies of you can take a control subject and fabricate some part of their life and convince them that it was real, and they would wholeheartedly believe it. There was one
There's some
study, I
ethical
don't recall.
concerns on that one. Holy.
There are some severe ethical concerns. I think the study I remember seeing was that it was this aspect of, they just started placing a photo of somebody that went on a hot air balloon trip,
Hmm?
and essentially started telling them, do you remember that time that you went on this trip? And they never had actually been on the hot air balloon, but because that picture existed
Hmm.
and they were reinforced by the people around them that it happened, over time that became a memory. Not just, I was convinced I did it, but you could actually take the imaging in the brain and see that all the same processes that a real memory would have are being triggered in the brain. So you have a completely false memory that the person has completely believes is real. I went through a lot of my life thinking I had broken my leg at a very brief time that I lived in Virginia. And I didn't know that didn't happen until I was 16, sitting at the table with my parents and my friends, and I asked my mom about it. And she's like, "You never broke your leg." I just had a reoccurring dream in my mind that I was throwing a football with my dad and I had broken my leg. That never happened. And I learned about it a decade and a half later, that it never was real.
That's super interesting. I wonder how you were saying storytellers might have better memory, and I wonder if it's yeah, it's a repetition thing or like they.
Yeah.
But when I'm thinking about that, and then it's like some of the the best storytellers in my family, especially of old school European family. Those old
Mhm.
guys can fabricate some crazy stories. Uh,
Yeah.
I had an uncle that was an avid fisherman, and like the lobsters kept getting bigger and bigger, and then like there was a shark in one of them, and then
Yeah.
his wife was always nodding in the corner, like, yeah, there it goes Bundy
Yeah.
again, and it's so it's like even then,
Yeah.
it's like I wonder how it's like the story itself starts becoming the truth, maybe not even the
Yeah.
memory, right? It's like memorizing
Hmm.
a prayer or like a childhood story. Like that's the truth now, and then the memory
Yeah.
that created that story is less of a concern now.
Yeah.
That's yeah. I mean it, it's hard. It's hard to like where do you go with that, And
Yeah.
it's
How do you accept being so vulnerable and flawed?
yeah,
Right.
and so
It's
much of our identities tied up in our memories, right?
hmm
Yeah. Uh, thinking about that, I mean, uh, thinking about how culture is like defined by memory and like our childhood and our upbringing and all that is all affected about yeah with our previous experiences, and we were talking about
Yeah.
how our previous experiences affected our view of architecture. Well, it
Yeah.
seems like a great way to tie this kind of tie the
Yeah.
knot or bring the circle back, and it's I could definitely see how yeah, so if culture is affecting how we view architecture, but then we
Yeah.
just kind of made the argument that our memory could be flawed. Like, how does that work, you know?
Yeah. Um, One thing I love to do is think about like the architecture for architects, right?
Hmm?
We are very fascinated in talking about a lot of certain aspects of architecture that 99.9% of the human race wouldn't even notice,
Yeah.
right? And we applaud it. It is a art of craft. It can result in absolute beauty or innovation or advancement to the humanities and the art of building, but most people won't know it, right? And that's because we've told ourselves these things. We've shared these stories, of the great architects and the things they did. And why is it so important to think all the way down to the smallest little detail that people don't notice and zoom all the way back out to the big thing that, the perspective that nobody will ever see from that angle.
Right. And the sun doesn't
Right.
actually like set on the north or whatever, you know?
Right, right. You got that stage lighting. Uh, so it's, but that's completely driven by this beautiful culture of arts and humanities and architecture, right? We're
Yeah.
striving and we're pushing, we're sharing our stories, we're admiring what we've deemed as success. Well, how many of us have not liked certain things pushed by other architecture schools, for example, right? You might have a school like SciArc, which is really driving in a lot of innovation and excitement and form exploration and technology and very deconstructivist and crazy looking things, right? And then you might have another school that, I'm not going to rattle one off right now, but that might be a little more traditional and still loves columns and pediments and some of the more historical flair,
Mhm.
right? Some more postmodern, high postmodern motifs brought into things here and there, or Curtin administration's love for all future government buildings need to be very Greek and classical to show power and authority, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
you one person really loves that, but another person doesn't, and then you have two competing identities, right?
Mm.
And that's formed by these groups of manipulated culture and idea. And these are not things that we grow up with a lot of control over. We're taught a lot of these things in school. We come out of school and we're like, this is the way to do architecture. And then we run into somebody that says, no, this is the way to do architecture. And we argue over it and we debate. But its basis is in storytelling and in culture and identity. So,
Yeah. I mean, it's how much control do you really have? It is always curious. I mean, looking back at, I went from basically my dad was a contractor. So like I knew I wanted to be an architect mostly because I was always on the job site and looking at, the plans and being like, "Well, I want to be the guy who draws this," you know? And that was my preconceived notion basically until I
mm,
got into architecture school. And like I think back, I was like, I probably should have picked up a couple architecture books and kind of like read that. It would have only helped in terms
mm,
of having a broader perspective on the thing. But all of this to say is like I just picked, Cal Poly, which is a
yeah,
fantastic school. But yeah, I didn't understand the like background and like their ideology and the way that they were gonna mentor me into the profession.
mm,
I think it aligned very well actually, and I loved my experience there. But like, yeah, it was totally like, who knows what would have happened to Laws if I decided to go to like SciArc or whatever, which was
right.
um, based in very close proximity, or went to USC or
Hmm.
something, and all three of those schools approach architecture in very different ways. So
Yeah,
I love that idea of like mentorship, and our profession is like it's defined by the mentorship, right? Like you cannot
yeah,
get you can get your degree, but you can't get licensed until you've practiced in the profession and documented it and had a
mm,
licensed architect, sign that off. So there's like all of this like heavy like influence that's placed on you from the very beginning until you're a licensed architect, and well beyond that, that
Mm.
is how much control do we really have over that? I think some,
Yeah.
especially as adults, right? But um, yeah, that's incredibly fascinating. Um,
Well, that kind of segues into something else
yeah,
about, control and conscious and non-conscious. So just to bring it back to the brain, right?
yeah,
And how cultures tie it into it. So, we have these it's the in group and the out group, right? You want to be in the in group because it's advantageous, and you have this us versus them mentality at a lot of aspects in life. Well, a lot of us like to think we have this solid identity, but that's not how humans have evolved to operate. We're here to survive and succeed. That's what this machine was built to do. And so in that we have these social and cultural dynamics of in groups and out groups. So, that one architecture school versus that other architecture school or what have you. Any in group out group scenario. We like to think we're concrete in that, but we're not. We actively and fluidly change what one would define as their identity based on the context we're in. And this is regularly and actively studied to see that, people portray the image of themselves outwardly and inwardly different based on the advantage of the situation they are in. And it's a biological system that's happening. It's happening with all the chemicals in your brain, all the hormones that are firing based off all these signals. So that idea of image and the power it has over us and whether we have control over it or not is a big important aspect, and it's important for designers to understand the responsibility that comes with what you do, because you are creating that image someone's going to take in, right? You're going to tell them this is the right way to do a building. Well, A, is it? Maybe, maybe not. That's your opinion. Oftentimes or not.
yeah,
There's some empirical aspects of it, but if I'm talking aesthetics, right, it's you're thinking this is the way of a building. This is how I inspire you. But it might not be. It might be divisive. It might be exploiting somebody or controlling somebody. So just to pitch it on the far end of this extreme of just the power that this has, I'm going to pitch another book and also just note overall, it seems like a lot of the things I studied were very negative, right? The driving factor was trying to understand how images and form and space control people and manipulate people, right?
yeah,
And how we design with intent to do that. So that's where just to tie it back because we haven't followed up the term insecurity that you brought up at the start. That was the main theme, was people's insecurity over their own image and that fluidity between that image that is dictated by our bodies and by our brains is the driving factor of how we feel and operate in space. So I'm going to plug another book, Robert Sapolsky's book, Behave. This was another profoundly life altering book to me. The subtitle is The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Our Worst. So I keep bringing up a lot like the worst aspects of things,
right.
right?
Well,
Um, how bad, how terrible are we? But there's a quote that resonated so strongly, and I put it in my paper. Is that quote? People are willing to kill and be killed over a cartoon, a flag, a piece of clothing, a song. We have to we have some explaining to do, right? And that last part of that statement, we have some explaining to do, is where we just fall back to a designer's responsibility of understanding the impact of what we're doing on people. And that's where this awareness, where studying neuroscience and studying what are the things that are actually happening, not necessarily conscious to us, right? What is a lot of people don't have agency over the space that they end up getting put in, or the news that's put in front of them, and the images that scroll across their TikToks, right?
mm,
They're just scrolling, and an algorithm decides what's put in front of them. The algorithm on Pinterest tells you what's a good design for a kitchen, and then someone tells you, "Hey, architect, this is the kitchen I want. This is what's cool, right?" And
yeah,
you're like, "I guess, maybe," but it's a lack of control unless people are educated and aware of what's happening. You can have acceptance and agency saying, I know I'm being manipulated. I'm just diving right in. Take me away, algorithms.
Right.
Take me away, designer. But there's an importance to understanding that awareness and sharing that awareness to say, hey, you are being controlled by something. And your knowledge and experience of how your body's working, that psychology, that neuroscience, will give you more agency over what the world is doing to you or what you are doing to the world, vice versa, right?
It's that knowledge applied, right? And it's
It is.
it's almost a difference between like intelligence and wisdom in a way too, where it's
Yeah.
like you need to know not just what but why. Um,
Mm.
it gets me to think. I don't think you're being overly negative. I guess just from my perspective on this
Mm.
conversation so far, it's just understanding. I guess the Spider-Man quote. The
Yeah.
with great power comes great responsibility, and I think we go a long way with having the right intentions because, like, I feel
Mhm.
like a lot of the examples that we were sharing, like fascist architecture or whatever, where they had a
Yeah.
very specific intent on um, controlling the
Mhm.
population, right? Or you can see
Mhm.
that with Soviet architecture, any kind of like
Yeah.
extremist thing where, if we come into it as, just regular architects, uh, like I just want to make a beautiful school and for the students to
Yeah.
enjoy being in that classroom. With that intention, hopefully we'll have our eyes open to things that could both, that could, provide a positive environment, And
Yeah.
I know intention isn't always enough, but at least it gets you in the right direction,
Yeah. The intent is the designer's responsibility, right?
Mm.
Um, we are actively doing something to somebody, to a lot of people. A lot of people, even outside of our lifetime, will have to live with things we do. Um, and I'm glad you brought up like K through 12. If you're designing a school, right? These are models of the world that you're giving a child.
Right.
You are telling a child this is what a room should be, and this is what a building should be. This is what a cafeteria is. This is what a gym is. I went to school in a suburban Texas elementary school that was built in the early 90s, and it was all brick, and the windows were small. It was, for all intents and purposes, brutalist. And our walls were coated in boards and colors and alphabet letters everywhere to just distract you like crazy.
Mm.
And it was a terrible building. I look back and they're ugly, they're not inspiring. They are one step outside of prisons. You know, they
Yeah.
they have the same methods of control of keeping eyes on kids and keeping them detained in their rooms and making sure that they're into the cafeteria and out of the cafeteria without fights.
Man.
And you're trying to control a lot of aspects and you build it all out of CMU block to the cheapest dollar possible. And
Look at
then
my example is the same. So it wasn't the high school I went to, luckily, but the public high school in my town in Apple Valley, Granite, it's like
Mhm.
this concrete building, and it had like chain link and barbed wire fence around the whole thing, and like it literally looked like a prison, and it was just like, God, I'm
Yeah,
glad I'm not going there. But that was like the majority of the people who I
yeah,
grew up in the town I grew up in. It was just kind of, yeah. I mean, you get like you mentioned how most people probably wouldn't perceive a building with the same kind of maybe nuance that an architect would,
yeah.
right? Because I mean, we're like trained professionals and like we just developed an eye for this sort of thing, but they definitely, I feel like, feel the building, right? If they don't,
Yeah.
right? And if it's like, yeah, if it looks hostile, if it looks cold,
Hmm.
the students are going to feel that way too and feel super alienated, ready to bust out of there kind of thing. So it's, um, yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. And then, you could it gets into implications that you might not even understand, where like we have a certain view of architecture, but like if we're building in like a different context, like around the world or something, and we don't
Hmm.
understand the implications that maybe a European centric kind of architecture might hold on a region. Like it could set off all sorts of crazy things where like you intended only the best
Yeah.
things, but in terms of that specific culture or whatever,
Mm.
you're uh, doing something harmful or you know
Yeah.
yeah
I kind of I kind of wish that I did this thesis at the time that AI was really becoming a widespread conversation, because it's this topic has a parallel in the fact that, you know, we're creating and designing worlds that become models for people and their space, their world. They have a model in their mind of how their city's mapped. They have a model in their mind where they're told this is the dangerous part of town, and this is why. The model in their mind of this is a hostile environment, this is a safe environment, and that's all again a model that's built in their mind based off of their culture, their context, what they've been told and taught, what they've been given is this is what a school is, this is what a grocery store is, this is where a good place for a playground is. But it's a model that we
yeah.
were trained on a model, like we're training AI,
You're
and so
blowing my
we're
mind
having
right
now these
now, dude.
conversations. We're,
It's
we're yeah, we're going through this ethical conversation about, well, what is an ethical thing to teach an AI, because then it's turning around doing that to us. Well,
yeah
guess what? We've been training humanity off models of what architecture and urban space are supposed to be this whole time. And there have been schools and theories, that's where architectural theory comes in and debates the ethics and morals, using history as examples of, well, this is an unethical way of treating humanity through design. Celebrating other examples of this celebrates humanity, this celebrates a culture, this cultivated healthy environments and good learning. People deserve daylight and fresh air. Don't do this brutalist cheap school that just incarcerated children for 6 years of their life,
yeah
right? Um, so viewing those two, like, what's the model we're training humanity off of? What is the example of a school that we should be giving children, or a hospital? What is a regenerative curing space for medical
Mm.
use that shortens, stays at hospitals and saves people money and really cares for a community, versus 20, 30 years ago, we built this example, this model of a hospital, which is shown to just make people feel miserable.
And there's been instances I know. I believe it was Hannah Lynn. Um, she was in the Miami studio. Um, I know that I think she had an innovation incubator specifically talking about like uh, what how did she term it? Basically, like existing prejudice in AI or something. Where like if you ask an AI like Mid Journey, I don't. They might have resolved this by now, but like in the beginning at least, draw me a picture of an architect talking to a client. It would always be like a dude for sure. It was always a dude, and then it was like 7 times out of 10 a white male. So it was interesting about how like AI has already developed a very very heavy bias, probably with no
Yeah.
real intention of doing it, just by the media it was consuming.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
and it gets into this whole ethical thing on how should we be training AI and how can we make it, look at the whole picture. And it's I guess the the thing that always kind of came in my brain was like it's probably impossible. Like it's always going to have some bias, unintended or not.
Well,
And doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but one thing that I was thinking about when you're talking about, humans were trained on a model, and I mean
hmm.
you can't really argue with that, right? You're born into a set of parents, and they're someone's going to raise you in a way that they see fit, and then
Hmm.
when they're not doing it, your school is and your friends are, and you're being influenced by all these factors that eventually accumulate into you. But there is a factor that AI doesn't have, at least not yet, where like there is still that you part of it, where you create something completely individual to yourself and you contribute to the model in some way, right? So
Yeah.
um, that's where it's like my biggest problem with AI is it's just ripping stuff apart and like gluing it back together, and there's no like creation being made there. Really, it's just
Hmm.
an amalgamation of already existing stuff, and it's
Yeah,
maybe, I mean, the person using AI can create something from that or something, but it's the I guess what I'm trying to say is, as humans, as we've been influenced by a model, we're also feeding back into it, right? we're
yeah,
we're feeding back into the model.
yeah.
um
There's a whole conversation of agency, right? And we can do part two in a few months if you want to get into the aspects of, is consciousness and reality real, right? That's a whole other part of agency in
yeah,
this process,
we'll
right?
do that in the morning so I
But
can come down and like sleep at night after, because I
yeah,
get an existential
yeah,
crisis in the evening. It would suck.
yeah. But there's this whole part of this process. Should we try the visual aid? Should I try to do
Yeah,
that?
let's
Can I
do it,
share screen?
please.
Let's
Yeah, I'm picking it up on
let's
Teams anyway.
okay. Um, There we go. So this is just kind of a simple model of a diagram of experience, right? So you have this consciousness up here, and you have this non-consciousness. So this is kind of built on the understanding that the bulk of what your brain does, you don't have access to.
Hmm.
It is completely just automatically doing things. And our conscious awareness is actually a very, very minute part of the reality of the world we live in. And it's the small amount that we feel like we have agency over, right? We feel like we are thinking. We feel that we are controlling this. Um, so in this kind of diagrammatic model, you have your consciousness, you have your motor skills. So this is, what comes out of it, right? But these are not necessarily, see, these two arrows are different things, right? This is because what your body does isn't necessarily, and this is, again, this is theory. So let me remind you,
Yep,
this is
yep.
theory. This is theory that your your behavior, your communication, what you say, what you do, your movements are not necessarily based on consciousness, right? There's some debates that your consciousness, what you actually experience of the world, is just you watching you do things. That your all the processes and the consciousness that's going on
Yeah.
is happening, and your consciousness is just you witnessing some small parts of it for some beneficial reason. So stimuli, your body processes it, it associates what it's processing, what is happening to it. There's a planning process that happens with your prefrontal cortex and your memory of, like, this is where I turn left, or there's something flying at me. My arm should swat this out of the way. Right? A fun
Mhm.
exercise: toss a ball at a friend and watch them smack it out of the air, and then ask them if they thought about it before they did it. They
Yeah.
probably didn't. Right? If they thought about it, it hit them in the face.
Right.
So, how much of the motor skill and the experience that we have of the world happens with consciousness? And that's a whole different debate. Not We should have a different conversation about that,
Well,
maybe with some whiskey and tequila involved. But
you know where
the
I
point
relate to
being
this?
is that there's a feedback loop, is that I'm trying to get at, and
Yeah.
that's where agency exists, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's conscious or not, our awareness of things, our awareness of the what's happening to us, what we're talking about is understanding the control that others have over us, and the very diverse perspectives of the world that exist, that we have, that the people around us have, is the agency that we have. We can control what we want to learn, the perspectives we want to take in, the
Yeah.
people we want to talk to, so we can diversify our experience. So when we're designing, we hear a wealth of perspectives that we can address. That is the agency that we can choose to have in this process.
Well, at a certain point, we get that agency, but I want to talk about this diagram before we go into that.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, this does merit its own conversation, most likely, especially with, yeah, I wouldn't turn down an old fashioned. But what this reminds me of, and the reason I feel like this is for sure, there's some truth to this diagram, even though it's theory, not proven. But I feel like athletes could relate to this. like so I grew up wrestling and wrestled in college, and there's a a flow state or flow wrestling
Mhm.
where you don't think, you just kind of go with it and just let your body do what it's gonna do, and that's when
Yeah.
you're like almost like I feel like the most creative kind of sessions if you're ever just sketching like crazy. You have to kind
Mhm.
of get through like a few bad sketches or half a roll of trace, but then eventually you're just kind of in it and
Yeah.
going for it, and that's where you're almost just letting you already know what you're gonna do. You just don't have to have that internal monologue. Um, that's extremely fascinating, and definitely feel like I hope people can relate to it because it could be pretty powerful.
Yeah. It's like doing that long grasshopper script, and you get to the end of it, and you have
Yeah.
no idea how you got there, right?
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
You're like, what was I thinking?
Yeah.
But you're just in a flow state, and you knew what you're doing. You knew how to do it. Athletes, that's a great parallel, right? We
Yeah.
we call these things like muscle memory, or you know, um, a very experienced person has just knowledge of the game, right?
Right.
They're not necessarily out on the blue line thinking about it. They're rotating. They're just doing it because they've got the experience, the ability. It just happens
Yeah.
for the most part. And that is a bulk of how we move through this world, right? We map
Right.
spaces without thinking about it. We've got cells and functions in our brain that create a mental map of the room we're in,
Yeah.
right?
You
And
don't
it
have to think
recalls.
about waking up and going to,
No,
start the pot of coffee or whatever. You just kind of do it.
yeah. If,
Um,
if if we had to think about everything that we did to a level, we wouldn't survive very long. We'd burn through our calories so quick,
yeah.
right? The big part of this is efficiency. The brain is built on efficiency, right? It's survival and efficiency. It uses a lot of energy to do what it does.
Man, this gets into like an evil architect could like leverage this in such a
It can, I
crazy
mean,
level, right? Like where you're just
again,
like, you're
yeah.
all just sheep, and I'm gonna like make you do exactly what I need you to
Well,
do in my building.
well, you know what? Maybe we might have just inspired a villain,
Nice.
but ideally we also inspired
Remember who
an
got you here, guys.
an we're hopefully we inspired an army of more aware people that
Yeah.
are more inspired to learn more about these things, right?
Yeah. That's
So I
fascinating.
mean, there's a lot of work. Stop sharing here and get back to our beautiful faces.
There you go.
Um, but it's yeah, I just lost the thought. No, but just
No.
awareness, right? It's awareness. That's what we get back to. So one of the questions I know you posed was like, what do we do with this,
Yeah.
right? What on earth? I'm given this. You just told me my memory's flawed and terrible. I don't have the agency that I thought I did in life. A lot of things are happening. I have no control over it in my own brain. I can't control my every emotion I have. What you're telling me, consciousness might not be real or impactful. We can dance around theory all day and look at the science and hear the reports and think about how this impacts design. But the number one aspect that you just have to get to is awareness and diversity and having some level of social plasticity. You need to remain, liberal in the ways that you interact with people because people are different.
Yeah.
Not everybody sees the world the same way you do. Not everybody had that same context that makes them see your house the same. Your house might be your childhood memory. Them looking at your house might be a feeling of oppression and bias in their city. They might have grown up in a part of town that saw your neighborhood as the elite. And that brings negative things where it brings positive things to you.
Yeah.
And being aware of that makes you an empathetic person, an empathetic designer, and allows you to get down to the core of what we should do as designers, and that's celebrate people, celebrate that diversity, and provide those healing and supportive spaces that celebrate the culture, the dynamic relationships that we have with our world and with each other, and understand that, again, it's that interaction. We are all here. We are not floating around separate identities inside a world. We all are of this world and with each other.
Yeah.
And that going at a design problem with that perspective gets rid of a lot of that animosity and that me versus you, us versus them dialogue that is naturally inherently put in our survivalist brains. We're trying to survive. I'm going to see them as a threat. Well, awareness and exposure and knowledge removes that threat. You know it's not a threat.
Yeah.
And that allows you to come to the table and solve a problem more mutually and celebratory.
Yeah. I know we're over time, so we'll wrap up. But I think that was an awesome kind of closing statement, and just one thing that I've seen, throughout my career, and the mentors and like design directors that I've always admired the most and seemed to be honestly the most successful were the ones who like really listened. Were like the
Yeah.
last ones to talk in a presentation, almost, where they would just sit back and kind of just listen to the client and listen to the all the perspectives going around, and like coalesce that into like a very strong idea. And it's something
Mm-hmm.
that I feel like, yeah, it's like the kernel of the idea we were talking about this whole time. It's We were talking about, let's celebrate people, let's embrace other people's perspectives, uh, and then just be empathetic architecture. I think that that'd be a um, cool studio name. Thanks again for joining the episode with Matt. If you liked, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any thoughts on future topics or would like to join the conversation, go ahead and leave a comment or message me directly.